Saving. Okay, we should be recording. Good morning, Beau. How are you doing?
Doing all right. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. So you were on a panel a few weeks ago, and you were talking about the kind of the history of Scotch and Irish whiskeys, and I heard it was a fascinating conversation. I just want to kind of capture your thoughts on that topic for our audience.
Sure, okay. So one of the interesting things to think about with liquor and whiskey drinking history is that, a lot of people already know the story about the reason why we have whiskey in the United States is because of the Scotch and Irish immigrants who came over to the United States, bringing their traditions of making shine up in the hills, and then they just transferred it to the holler and got on a bit of an accent as they started doing it over here. What's interesting, though, is looking at the drinking history of the United States because you have a couple different interesting quirks that happened with it. First off, one I think is most interesting is that America's national drink, right at the founding of the country, wasn't whiskey, it wasn't even beer, it was really rum. That was the most popular American spirit, and I really think that's an interesting period. And right next to rum was hard apple cider. We call it hard apple cider. Really, it's just cider and apple juice, but that's conversation. But so I think that's a really interesting like beginning to the history. But then when you get a little bit further down the line, 100 years later or so, what you end up seeing is when it came to imported whiskey's popularity in the United States up to Prohibition, the Irish were the leaders. And a lot of that was driven by the fact that there were so many Irish immigrants in the United States, especially compared to Scotch immigrants. And there wasn't a shortage of Scotch immigrants either, all of that being driven by domestic and political turmoil at home, war, starvation, all that stuff. Same reason why people go from border to border today. But because there was such a large base of Irish born or first generation Irish in the United States, Irish whiskey was the more popular imported spirit in that time period before Scotch whiskey was. So this is why when Prohibition hit, it was particularly devastating to Irish whiskey producers because their largest import market was the United States. For the Scotch, meanwhile, that wasn't necessarily the case because the Irish dominated US so much, they ended up sending their whiskey to other places across continental Europe, hence the enduring popularity of Scotch whiskey places like France, etc. You have a broader base of popularity worldwide for Scotch whiskey. Meanwhile, and also South America too. Don't forget, especially brands like Buchanan's. Meanwhile, the Irish were so laser focused on the U.S. that when Prohibition hit the U.S., they were crushed by it. So what the situation was is you ended up in the 1970s, the entire Irish whiskey industry had consolidated down from hundreds of distillers to one, Irish Distillers Limited, who are the producers today of Jameson, Middleton, and Red Spot, Yellow Spot series. In fact, Jameson is an entire plan because they were like, we have to come up with something to rebuild our industry from scratch. And they went all in on Jameson and then decided to build the brand and the category out from there. So that's the reason why you ended up in a situation where after Prohibition ended and you could begin exporting to the United States again, what you saw happen was the Irish were so devastated by it that the Scotch started attacking it really hard. And then from there, they never really gave it up. They just maintained that high level of imports. It really rose to its peak during the Mad Men era. Same
Mm-hmm.
for bourbon as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they have maintained that rarefied air ever since. It's only in the last 10 to 20 years that you've seen well, no, go back a little bit further, more like 30 years now,
Mm-hmm.
that you've seen Irish whiskey really
Right. True. True.
back. But the next question that you mentioned was, well, what's going on with the Irish whiskey industry now?
Mm-hmm.
And speaking, as a malt provider, what we've seen happen was there's cycles in the industry and in the business. I mean, there have been different time periods when Scotch industry, no, sorry, I've got a retainer in, so a little bit less. But there have been different time periods where Scotch whiskey has also collapsed down too. This happens on a fairly regular basis. Business cycles flow and ebb. People get into something, then the next generation that comes after, they want to do something else. That's not a surprise. But what we've seen was we think that the Irish whiskey industry should have gone through a downturn cycle about 4 or 5 years back. But what happened then?
COVID.
COVID.
Yeah.
COVID lockdowns occurred. So because of that, instead of the industry, a bunch of new players came into the space. You saw a whole bunch more whiskey being made. And so the end result of that was that instead of going through a downturn cycle that would have managed the amount of supply in the market at reasonable levels
Mhm.
and would have managed the amount of players in the market, you didn't have that. You had people buying a whole bunch of stuff just because they had money to spend because they weren't traveling anywhere and they wanted to hoard and they wanted to, hoard something. You saw similar things in a variety of different industries. All of a sudden, used Rolex prices are exploding. Bourbon's really hard to find. Everybody's making sourdough, right? People pick different things to get
Mhm.
into, and one of those things was collecting Irish whiskey.
Yeah.
And so now it's been a few years down the line, and we finally come down from that, frankly, artificial boost that
Mhm.
happened because of a once a century plague event. And it's not even dissimilar to what happened in the last century either. When the Spanish flu happened,
Mhm.
that's this seems like a thing that happens once a
Yeah.
century,
Right. 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 It's
and
predictable.
COVID was it for us.
Yeah.
So yeah, unfortunately, the Irish industry for distilling is getting hit really hard right now. There's a lot of folks going out of business. There's receivership. They're going into receivership. The
Sure.
fact of the matter is, the market probably got too saturated, and it's unfortunate because some really good producers are paying the price for that, and you're seeing a lot of product that's just sitting around and they'll get some nice age on it, but you don't want all the whiskey to age for a long time. That
Mhm.
doesn't mean it's going to be uniformly good.
Exactly. And where do you see that intersection with like the specialty malts that you sell to some of these people like Waterford, for instance, that, well, I mean, granted, they were doing their own crops and doing complete farm to table sort of propositions, but a lot of people were playing with different kind of malts and trying to innovate. Do you still see that innovation happening at a lower scale or gone, or what's your observation on that?
I don't think that innovation is necessarily gone because smaller producers always need to innovate to some degree so they can make an impact in the market at all. So someone like Waterford, whose reputation was golden, in their situation, what they were focusing on was Irish terroir, and they were focusing on heritage barley varieties because they specifically wanted to make whiskey like their ancestors made. But the fact is, the Irish category, there's a bit more room to do different things than you can maybe necessarily get with Scotch, as long as you're willing to give up on calling your thing single malt, right?
Right.
That category, that name matters to some people. But if you look at it historically, though, it wasn't always the case where everybody was making their whiskey with only malted barley all the time.
Hmm.
Oats grow really well in Scotland, so it's kind of a bummer that we tend to look down on grain
Yeah.
Scotch whiskies when oats are a fabulous addition to any malt gill, and they give a wonderful silky feel to the
Yeah.
body and character of the spirit. It's the same situation in Ireland. We saw a little bit of that variety go away. But meanwhile, you do see some producers who are experimenting with rye. My company just imported some Irish rye very recently, as a matter of fact, to
Hmm.
sell to US distillers.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
I don't think innovation isn't necessarily going to go, and that's just in terms of using different like raw ingredients. That's before you even think about the fact that nowadays, when you have malted barley producers like the company that I work for, who I won't name, right? And with those producers, they are making large batches of completely uniform pale malt, and the quality is incredibly high. It's really fermentable. It's easy to work with in the brew house, and all of it's going to be the same color. 120, 150 years ago, that was not the case
Hmm.
at all. What you instead had with malt houses was that they would produce malt of wildly varying quality. Some of it would get scorched. Some of that malt would caramelize. So what I think you ended up with that was going into your grist bill for the spirit you were making was a lot closer to what a modern craft beer producer would use to make something like an amber ale or a pale ale. You'd
Hmm.
have a little bit of colored malt with unfermentable sugars, and you would have some that was roasted. And I think you could get some really interesting results out of a grist bill that goes like that. And I'm seeing that happen more and more with small craft producers in the United States. One of the first best examples of that I had is Hatch Distilling up in Door County in Wisconsin. But using pinch of black malt, using some caramel malts, and seeing if you end up with a spirit that maybe has a little bit more interesting depth than you would get with just 100% pale malt. And I think that's really the next frontier when it comes to American single malt whiskey, which is now its own defined category. And I would like to see that happen a little bit more with both Irish whiskey and Scotch whiskey.
Hmm. Yeah, we had that excellent example from Method and Madness of that single grain Irish whiskey that was just, it was a stunner. And there's so much
Yeah.
potential there. I think you're right.
Yeah.
So you talked about bringing in some Irish rye for American craft producers, which I love the cross pollination of that. Um,
Yeah.
can you speak to just sort of the impact of the more recent tariff announcements? We're talking here on July 14th, 2025.
Yeah, exactly. Who knows what's going to be tomorrow? That's the whole thing. It's been basically like a yo-yo in terms of tariffs are announced, and then within 1 to 2 weeks, sometimes even a month, before they ever hit a deadline, they all of a sudden go away. And it's a little bit of a bipolar kind of situation, right? Where all of a sudden, freak out, freak out. Okay, they made a deal. Don't freak out, freak out. It
Hmm.
keeps happening. Now I think everybody's just a little bit desensitized towards it,
Yeah.
and it's not that people aren't worried about it. We're all watching the situation very carefully, but what you do see is a bit of resignation, like, okay, here's the latest political theater, and it's gone. All right. And then a few months later, whenever the news cycle is too quiet and folks are a little bit bored, I'm going to announce new
Yeah.
tariffs. And then all of a sudden, then it goes away.
Yeah. It's tacoed out.
So
What
there's
about?
just a bit of resignation. And there's certainly a lot of irritation in the industry too,
Yeah. I was going to say, what are the
but it isn't really affecting pricing for barley
okay.
because, you know, barley pricing gets affected much, much more by the weather. That is by far the biggest determinant factor. And what we've seen in North America in the growing region, which spans the Great Plains from the US side all the way up into the Canadian prairies, is frankly pretty decent weather lately. So we're really happy with where that's going.
Mhm.
And so that's what's keeping prices consistent more than anything else.
Excellent. And is that similar in Europe too, with like the European malts and specialty malts and things like that you're bringing over? Or is it tariffs having an impact on people innovating with those kind
Tariffs
of
are
things?
already having an impact on those. Tariffs, yes, yeah. Tariffs are already having an impact. It's not a terribly high impact. The thing is, for craft producers, if they're importing European barley, they've already resigned themselves to paying a premium because it has to get on a boat and it has to come over here to the United States because you have convinced yourself that the character you get from this barley, whether it's from Ireland, or Scotland or the UK or Germany, France and Germany grow about the same amount of barley.
Hmm.
Not a lot of people realize that.
Yeah.
But you've already sort of resigned yourself to paying a premium for that. So an additional, right now, I believe on the EU, it's about 10% tariff.
Hmm.
So that hasn't had such a horrific impact. But if you talk about tariffs on Canadian barley and grain, if they were to be fully implemented and for a significant length of time, that would devastate the entire beer industry. Like, oh, it's just 30% tariff. How bad could it
Hmm.
be? Well, now your $10 six pack is now 13 to 15 at least.
Hmm.
So are you gonna, and that's for just any beer at all,
Right.
because Canada is growing the vast majority of North America's barley. The United States grows some, but it's on a ratio of like if Canada is growing 10 million metric tons, the US is growing three. Like that's the ratio. I can't recall the exact numbers off the top of my head right now, and I'd have to reference.
3 to 1,
But
something
that's
like
how
that.
much more Canada is growing than the US.
Mhm.
So if something like that ever did happen, it would absolutely brutalize not it would brutalize all beer making across the entire continent, Mexico too, because most Mexican beer is made with Canadian barley that has to travel through the United States. So it's got to go all the way down there and then come back up into the US. So would the
Uh,
barley get taxed going through the US to Mexico? Would it not? Is the beer getting taxed when it comes into the? It's just a
yeah,
big mess. And so the fact that this can keeps getting kicked down the road, I don't think anybody's really very
yeah.
upset.
No, good observation
Because
on the.
it's just chaos. It's new chaos all the time, but it's chaos that just seems to be noise and distraction as opposed to actually affecting things very much. If you're very careful and your timing is precise, then you haven't been affected by this.
Mhm. Well,
But it's
great.
hard to play. It's hard to roll those dice over and over and over and over and over
Right.
again.
There's a frustration to that, right? Like you said, people are
Yeah.
getting desensitized and it's tough to really plan. And you might want to make other plans in an environment where you don't have so many questions about your input costs.
Yeah, but what are those other plays?
Yeah, right. Exactly what the options
Yeah.
are. If you want to make beer, you got to deal with Canadian barley. So, well, thank you, Bo. This has
Yes.
been great. I really appreciate your time. And I'm sure my audience is really going to glean some good nuggets from our conversation.
My pleasure having chatted.
Good seeing you, Bo. Take care.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.
All right.
Yeah. Turn this off here.